James Harrington was not your average millionaire. He had clawed his way to the top of the business world, starting with nothing but a dream and an unrelenting work ethic. Born into a modest family, he grew up watching his parents struggle to make ends meet. But James was different. He had ambition and he wasn't afraid to chase it. By the time he turned 40, he owned several successful companies, lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town, and drove cars that most people could only dream of owning. To the outside world, James seemed to have it all: money, power, and influence. But despite his success, James often found himself restless. Deep down, he felt disconnected from the world around him. His life was filled with luxury, but it lacked meaning. The more wealth he accumulated, the lonelier he became. He spent hours scrolling through social media, reading articles about poverty, inequality, and the struggles of everyday people. One particular article caught his attention. It was about how easy it was for the wealthy to lose touch with reality, living in their bubble of privilege while ignoring the hardships faced by others. The article struck a chord with James. It made him question whether he had become one of those people, the kind who talks about helping others but never truly understands what it feels like to be in need. He thought about all the times he'd written checks to charities or attended fancy fundraisers, patting himself on the back for being a good person. But had he ever really stepped into someone else's shoes? Had he ever experienced what it was like to depend on the kindness of strangers? That night, as James sat in his opulent study sipping a glass of expensive whiskey, an idea began to form in his mind. What if he could experience life from the other side of the fence? What if he could see the world through the eyes of someone less fortunate? The thought excited and terrified him at the same time. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Pretending to be poor would mean giving up everything he had worked so hard for, even if just for a short while. But the more he thought about it, the more determined he became to try. The next morning, James woke up early, his heart racing with anticipation. He rummaged through his closet, searching for clothes that looked worn out and dirty. He found an old pair of jeans with holes in the knees and a faded jacket that hadn't seen daylight in years. To complete the look, he smeared dirt on his face and hands, making sure he looked as disheveled as possible. Standing in front of the mirror, James barely recognized himself. Gone was the confident businessman. In his place stood a man who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Before leaving the house, James grabbed a piece of cardboard and scribbled a simple message on it: "Anything helps." He hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was such a good idea after all. What if someone recognized him? What if his plan backfired? Shaking off his doubts, he reminded himself why he was doing this: to learn, to grow, and maybe even to change. With a deep breath, James walked out of his mansion and positioned himself near the gated entrance, clutching his makeshift sign tightly. As he sat there on the cold pavement, James couldn't help but feel nervous. Cars passed by, their drivers glancing at him curiously. Some slowed down, while others sped past without a second thought. James wondered what they must be thinking. Did they pity him? Judge him? Or did they simply ignore him altogether? He tried to imagine what it would be like to live like this every day, to rely on the generosity of strangers for survival. It was a humbling thought, one that left him feeling both grateful and uneasy. Despite his nerves, James was determined to stick with his plan. He wanted to see how people would react, not just random passers-by, but also his friends, neighbors, and even his own family. Would they recognize him beneath the disguise? More importantly, would they treat him with kindness or indifference? As the hours ticked by, James braced himself for whatever was coming next. Little did he know, his experiment would reveal truths about humanity and himself that he could never have anticipated. Time seemed to move slowly as James settled into his role as a beggar. He watched the world go by, observing the subtle interactions between people. A mother pushing a stroller smiled warmly at him, though she didn't stop to give anything. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they walked past, pointing at him and whispering among themselves. Each encounter added another layer to James's understanding of human nature. Some people were compassionate while others were judgmental. And then there were those who simply didn't care at all. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, James began to notice patterns in the way people treated him. Wealthier individuals tended to avoid eye contact, as if looking at him might somehow taint them. Middle-class workers, on the other hand, were more likely to acknowledge his presence even if they didn't offer any help. It was fascinating and heartbreaking to witness these dynamics play out in real time. James realized that this experiment wasn't just about testing others. It was also about confronting his own biases and assumptions. By mid-morning, James's stomach started to growl. He hadn't eaten since the night before, and the hunger pangs were becoming harder to ignore. Normally, he would have ordered breakfast delivered to his mansion or cooked something in his state-of-the-art kitchen. But today, he had no choice but to sit there, waiting for scraps of food or loose change. The experience was sobering. For the first time in years, James understood what it meant to feel powerless, to rely on others for basic necessities. It was a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Despite the discomfort, James refused to give up. He reminded himself that this was just the beginning. There were still many hours and many lessons ahead. As he adjusted his position on the hard pavement, James prepared himself for whatever came next. He didn't know it yet, but his journey was about to take some unexpected turns. The morning sun grew brighter, casting long shadows across the pavement where James sat. The air was crisp, and the occasional breeze carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the well-manicured lawns of his neighborhood. People were starting to trickle out of their homes, some heading to work, others going for a jog or walking their dogs. James watched them all, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment he would begin to see how people truly reacted when faced with someone in need. A young woman was the first to approach him. She wore athletic leggings and carried a yoga mat under one arm, her golden retriever trotting happily beside her. As she walked past, she glanced at James, her eyes flickering over his tattered clothes and dirt-streaked face. For a brief second, their gazes met, but she quickly looked away. Then, almost hesitantly, she reached into her pocket and dropped a few coins into the cup James held in his lap. The sound of metal clinking against plastic echoed softly in the quiet morning. "Thank you," James murmured, his voice raspy and unsteady. He hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable saying those two simple words. The woman nodded curtly, avoiding eye contact again, and hurried off without another word. Her dog wagged its tail once before following her down the street. James stared after her, wondering what had gone through her mind during that brief interaction. Had she felt pity, guilt, or had it simply been habit, a reflexive act of charity? Moments later, an elderly man shuffled by, leaning heavily on an eye cane. His steps were slow and deliberate, and his weathered face bore the marks of a life lived fully. When he noticed James sitting there, he paused, studying him with kind, curious eyes. "Are you all right, son?" the old man asked, his voice gentle yet firm. James swallowed hard, caught off guard by the genuine concern in the stranger's tone. I'll be fine," James replied haltingly. "Just trying to get by." The man nodded thoughtfully, then reached into the small pouch attached to his belt. Pulling out a crumpled dollar bill, he placed it carefully in James's cup. "Take care of yourself," he said with a warm smile, before continuing on his way. Watching the frail figure disappear around the corner, James felt a lump rise in his throat. There was something profoundly moving about the way the old man had treated him, not as a beggar but as a fellow human being. But not everyone was so kind. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the gate of James's mansion, its engine purring like a contented cat. Richard, one of James's closest friends and business associates, stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit and polished leather shoes. Richard was a man who prided himself on appearances, always striving to project an image of success and sophistication. As he approached the gate, he spotted James sitting on the curb. For a split second, Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. But instead of stopping to investigate further, He merely wrinkled his nose in distaste and muttered under his breath, "Lazy beggars, always looking for handouts." Without another glance, he climbed back into his car and sped off, leaving behind a trail of exhaust fumes. James sat frozen, stunned by the casual cruelty of his friend's words. How could someone he considered a confidant dismiss him so easily? It was as if Richard hadn't even seen him, just a stereotype, a faceless nuisance to be ignored. As the day wore on, more people passed by, each reaction adding another layer to James's growing understanding of human behavior. Some ignored him completely, staring straight ahead as though he didn't exist. Others gave him fleeting glances filled with pity or disdain. A teenage boy on a skateboard tossed a crumpled candy wrapper into James's cup, laughing as he skated away. A middle-aged woman clutching a designer handbag crossed the street to avoid walking too close to him, her lips pursed in disapproval. Yet amidst the indifference and judgment, there were moments of unexpected kindness. A delivery driver stopped his van near the gate and handed James a sandwich wrapped in foil. "I saw you sitting here earlier," the man explained with a shrug. "Figured you might be hungry." James accepted the food gratefully, touched by the gesture. Later, a mother pushing a stroller paused to chat with him briefly, asking if he needed anything. Though her questions were polite rather than probing, James appreciated the effort she made to engage with him. Each encounter left James with a whirlwind of emotions. He felt gratitude for the strangers who showed compassion, frustration toward those who judged him based on his appearance, and sadness for the countless individuals who chose to look the other way. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, to sit there hour after hour, absorbing the weight of humanity's contradictions. Yet he couldn't bring himself to quit. Not yet. Every person who walked by revealed something new about society, about privilege, and about himself. By late morning, James began to notice patterns emerging. Wealthier residents tended to avoid him entirely, their polished exteriors masking a deep-seated discomfort with poverty. They seemed to view him as an inconvenience, a blemish on the otherwise pristine landscape of their upscale neighborhood. Middle-class workers, however, were more likely to acknowledge him, offering small gestures of kindness or at least a nod of recognition. It was as if their own struggles gave them a greater capacity for empathy. One particularly jarring moment came when a group of teenagers sauntered past, laughing and joking loudly. One of them pointed at James and sneered, "Looks like someone needs a job." His friends erupted in laughter, their voices carrying far beyond what James imagined they intended. He forced himself to remain still, resisting the urge to snap back or reveal his true identity. Instead, he lowered his head, letting his hair fall forward to hide his face. The humiliation burned hot in his chest, but he reminded himself that this was part of the experiment. If he wanted to understand what it meant to live on the margins, he had to endure the insults as well as the kindness. Despite the challenges, James found himself reflecting deeply on the nature of connection, or lack thereof, in modern society. In a world dominated by technology and social media, people often went out of their way to avoid real, meaningful interactions. Even in this affluent neighborhood, where neighbors knew each other by name, there was a palpable sense of isolation. Everyone was busy living their own lives, chasing their own dreams, and worrying about their own problems. James realized that his presence on the curb served as a mirror, forcing people to confront aspects of themselves they might otherwise prefer to ignore. As noon approached, James's stomach growled insistently, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the night before. Normally, hunger was a temporary inconvenience, easily remedied by ordering takeout or raiding the fridge. But today he had no such luxuries. The sandwich from the delivery driver had been a godsend, but it wasn't enough to sustain him for long. He clenched his jaw, determined to push through the discomfort. After all, millions of people around the world faced this reality every single day. Not because they chose to, but because they had no other option. Despite the physical toll, James refused to give up. Each passing hour brought new insights, new stories, and new reminders of the complexity of human nature. He knew that the hardest parts of his experiment were still ahead, especially when his own family arrived home. But for now, he focused on observing, listening, and learning. Little did he know the most shocking revelations were yet to come. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the driveway of James's mansion, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was Emily, James's teenage daughter, returning home from school. She walked briskly, her backpack slung over one shoulder and earbuds nestled snugly in her ears. Her eyes were fixed on her phone screen as she scrolled through social media, oblivious to the world around her. James watched her approach, his heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment he had been dreading and secretly hoping for all day. At first, Emily didn't notice him. She was too absorbed in whatever drama unfolded on her phone. But as she neared the gate, something caught her attention. A disheveled man sitting cross-legged on the curb, holding a cardboard sign. Confusion flickered across her face as she slowed her pace, finally removing one earbud. For a brief second, her gaze lingered on James, but there was no recognition in her expression. To her, he was just another stranger, another faceless person, begging for change. "Hey," Emily said cautiously, her tone tinged with unease. "Are you okay?" James hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wanted to tell her who he really was, to see if she would recognize him beneath the disguise. But he also knew that revealing himself now might ruin the experiment. Instead, he nodded slowly and muttered, "Yeah, I'm all right. Just trying to get by." Emily frowned, clearly uncomfortable. She glanced around nervously as if searching for an escape route. Then, after a long pause, she sighed and said, "Look, my dad always talks about helping people and stuff, but honestly, I don't think anyone deserves handouts. You should probably find a job or something." Her words hit James like a punch to the gut. The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable, and it stung more than he cared to admit. Before James could respond, Emily turned on her heel and hurried toward the house, eager to put distance between herself and the awkward situation. Watching her go, James felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. Was this really how his own daughter thought? Had his teachings about kindness and generosity fallen on deaf ears? Or had she simply adopted the same judgmental attitudes he'd seen in others throughout the day? Moments later, the sound of tires crunching against gravel signaled the arrival of Claire, James's wife. She pulled up in her sleek silver SUV, her designer sunglasses reflecting the sunlight as she stepped out of the car. Dressed in tailored jeans and a crisp blouse, Claire exuded confidence and poise. As she approached the gate, her gaze landed on James, and her perfectly arched eyebrows shot up in surprise. "What is this?" Claire demanded, her voice sharp and clipped. She crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at James as though he were some kind of pest invading her pristine property. "Who are you and why are you sitting here?" James opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, Claire cut him off. "This neighborhood doesn't need this kind of trash," she snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "Go somewhere else." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her car, pulling out her phone to make a call. James strained to hear her conversation, catching snippets of what she was saying. "Some beggar outside our gate. Yes, call security. Get rid of him immediately." Her reaction left James reeling. He had expected indifference, perhaps even disdain, but never outright hostility, not from his own wife. Claire's refusal to even consider helping someone in need, combined with her eagerness to have him removed, was shocking. It made him question everything he thought he knew about her. How could the woman he loved so deeply be so cold and unfeeling? Security arrived within minutes, two burly men in uniform stepping out of a patrol car. They approached James with stern expressions, their hands resting on their utility belts. One of them spoke gruffly. "Sir, we've received reports of a disturbance. You'll need to leave the premises." James held up his hands in surrender, feigning confusion. "I'm not causing any trouble," he protested weakly. "I'm just sitting here." The guards exchanged skeptical glances. "You can't stay here," one of them said firmly. "This is private property." Reluctantly, James gathered his belongings, a threadbare jacket, his makeshift sign, and the plastic cup containing a few coins, and shuffled away from the gate. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving Claire ample time to watch him retreat. As he disappeared around the corner, he glanced back to see her standing near the gate, shaking her head in irritation. The sight broke his heart. Once he was out of sight, James found a quiet spot nearby and sat down again, his mind racing with thoughts. He replayed the events of the past hour, the dismissive comments from Emily, the harsh words from Claire, and the humiliating encounter with security. Each interaction chipped away at his faith in humanity, especially when it came to those closest to him. How could the people who supposedly loved him fail to see the person beneath the disguise? More importantly, what did their reactions say about the values they truly held? As the initial shock began to wear off, James started to reflect on his family dynamics. He realized that despite his efforts to instill compassion and empathy in Emily and Claire, his actions may have spoken louder than his words. Over the years, he had showered them with luxury and privilege, providing for their every need without teaching them the importance of gratitude or selflessness. Perhaps in doing so, he had inadvertently created a bubble, one where wealth insulated them from the struggles of the outside world. But James wasn't ready to give up just yet. He decided to return to the gate later that evening, determined to confront his family and force them to reckon with their behavior. Until then, he resolved to continue observing the world around him, absorbing every lesson this experience had to offer. Little did he know the most surprising and heartwarming moment of his experiment was still waiting just around the corner. Hours passed, and the neighborhood grew quieter as the afternoon wore on. Most residents had returned home, retreating, behind closed doors to enjoy the comforts of their lives. James remained seated on the pavement, his body aching from hours of sitting in the same position. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and fatigue weighed heavily on his shoulders. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, he refused to abandon his mission. Every passerby offered another glimpse into the complexities of human nature, another reminder of the invisible barriers that separated people from one another. Just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a young boy appeared on the scene. His name was Tommy, and he lived in a modest house a few blocks away. Clad in worn sneakers and a faded t-shirt, Tommy carried a soccer ball under one arm and a backpack slung over the other. Unlike many of the adults James had encountered, Tommy didn't hesitate when he saw the beggar sitting by the gate. Instead, he stopped in his tracks, tilting his head curiously. "Hi," Tommy said brightly, his voice filled with innocence and curiosity. "What are you doing here?" James smiled faintly, touched by the boy's openness. "Just resting for a bit," he replied softly. "Long day." Tommy nodded sagely, as though he understood exactly what James meant. Then, without missing a beat, he plopped down beside him, setting his soccer ball aside. "Do you want some food?" he asked, rummaging through his backpack. Before James could protest, Tommy produced half a sandwich wrapped in foil and handed it to him. "I saved this from lunch, you can have it." Overwhelmed by the gesture, James accepted the offering with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's very kind of you." Tommy shrugged nonchalantly, as if sharing his meal was the most natural thing in the world. "My mom says everyone has problems we can't see," he explained matter-of-factly. "So it's important to be nice even if you don't know what's going on." James stared at the boy, marveling at his wisdom. In that moment, he realized that true kindness wasn't about grand gestures or calculated acts of charity. It was about simple, genuine connections. It was about seeing someone not as a label or a stereotype, but as a human being worthy of respect and care. And in Tommy's innocent smile, James found a glimmer of hope, a reminder that empathy could still thrive, even in a world often consumed by selfishness and indifference. As the evening shadows lengthened, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day's experiences had been painful, humbling, and eye-opening in equal measure. But they had also shown him that change was possible, if Only people were willing to look beyond themselves and embrace the humanity in others. As the golden hues of sunset bathed the neighborhood in a warm glow, James sat quietly on the curb, his mind swirling with thoughts. The day had been long and emotionally draining, but it wasn't over yet. He clutched the half-eaten sandwich Tommy had given him, savoring not just the taste of the food but the profound impact of the boy's kindness. For the first time since he began his experiment, James felt a flicker of hope amidst the disappointment and disillusionment. Tommy's simple act of generosity reminded him that humanity still held light, even in its darkest corners. But James knew there was more work to be done, more truths to uncover, more lessons to learn. As dusk settled in, the streetlights flickered on, casting soft halos of yellow across the pavement. Families retreated indoors, shutting their doors against the encroaching night. Yet James remained outside, determined to see this through until the end. He couldn't shake the image of Claire's disdainful glare or Emily's dismissive words. Their reactions gnawed at him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own life and choices. It was then that an idea struck him, an idea so bold it made his heart race. What if he revealed himself? What if he pulled back the curtain and showed the people around him who he truly was? Would it change anything? Would it make them rethink their actions? Or would they simply brush it off as some eccentric millionaire's prank? James wrestled with the thought for several minutes, weighing the risks and rewards. Finally, he decided to go for it. After all, what was the point of this experiment if he didn't push boundaries and challenge perceptions? The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Just as twilight deepened into night, Richard, the same friend who had earlier muttered under his breath about lazy beggars, pulled up to the gate in his gleaming luxury car. James recognized the sound of the engine immediately. It was unmistakable, a throaty growl that announced its owner's wealth before the vehicle even came into view. Richard stepped out of the car, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. His polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he strode toward the mansion, completely unaware of the man sitting nearby. James took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to happen. Slowly he stood up, brushing dirt from his tattered clothes. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed the hat that had concealed his face all day. As Richard approached the gate, he glanced sideways and froze. Recognition dawned slowly on his face, followed by confusion, then disbelief. "Jim," Richard stammered, blinking rapidly as though trying to process what he was seeing. Is that you?" James nodded, offering a wry smile. "Surprise?" For a moment, Richard said nothing. He simply stared at James, his mouth hanging slightly open. Then, as the initial shock wore off, a nervous laugh bubbled out of him. "Oh my God, Jim, you scared the hell out of me." He shook his head, chuckling awkwardly. "Good one, buddy. Really got me there." James frowned, taken aback by Richard's reaction. "You're not upset?" he asked cautiously. "Upset? Why would I be upset?" Richard replied, waving a hand dismissively. "It's just a joke, right? You pretending to be a beggar? Classic Jim move, always full of surprises." James felt a pang of frustration. Here he was, baring his soul and exposing a deeply personal experiment, and Richard dismissed it as nothing more than a harmless prank. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harsh words Richard had spoken earlier. Instead, he treated the entire situation as entertainment, something to laugh about over drinks later. Before James could respond, another car pulled into the driveway. It was Claire, returning from running errands. She stepped out of her SUV, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. When she saw James standing near the gate, her eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone laced with irritation. "I thought security told you to leave." James removed his fake beard, revealing his clean-shaven face beneath. "Claire," he said softly. "It's me." Claire blinked, her expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief. "James," she gasped, her voice rising an octave. "What on earth are you doing dressed like that?" I wanted to understand what it feels like to be invisible, James explained, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. To see how people treat someone they think is less fortunate, and guess what? I learned a lot today, including how quickly you called security to have me removed. Claire flushed red, her composure cracking under the weight of James's accusation. Well, I didn't know it was you, she snapped defensively. How was I supposed to recognize you looking like that? Honestly, James, this whole thing is ridiculous. You're embarrassing yourself, and us. Her words stung, cutting deeper than James had anticipated. He turned to Richard, hoping for some semblance of support, but his friend merely shrugged. She's got a point, Jim, Richard said lightly. This neighborhood isn't exactly the place for, well, whatever this is. James felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. Was this really how they viewed him? As someone whose behavior needed to conform to societal expectations regardless of its purpose? He clenched his fist, struggling to keep his emotions in check. So that's it? He shot back, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. You both judged me based on appearances without stopping to think for even a second that there might be more to the story? Do you realize how hypocritical that is? Claire crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. Don't turn this around on us, James. You're the one who chose to play dress-up and sit outside our house like some kind of vagrant. Don't expect us to feel guilty for reacting the way anyone else would. And what way is that? James challenged, stepping closer. Ignoring someone because they don't fit your idea of acceptable? Treating them like they're invisible unless they meet your standards? Richard raised his hands in surrender, clearly eager to diffuse the tension. All right, let's not blow this out of proportion, he interjected nervously. It's just a little social experiment, right? No harm done. No harm done? James echoed incredulously. Do you have any idea how dehumanizing it feels to be treated like garbage? To be dismissed, judged, and ignored simply because of how you look? Or does that not matter as long as you can sleep comfortably at night knowing you live behind a gated community? The silence that followed was deafening. Claire shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while Richard fiddled with his watch, clearly unsure of what to say. James took a step back, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He had hoped that revealing himself would spark a meaningful conversation, a chance for reflection and growth. But instead he was met with excuses and defensiveness. Just as the argument seemed to reach a stalemate, Emily appeared in the doorway of the mansion. She had been watching the exchange from a distance, her expression unreadable. Now, she stepped forward hesitantly, her phone dangling loosely in her hand. Dad? She said softly, breaking the tense silence. What's going on? James looked at his daughter, his heart aching with a mixture of love and sorrow. He wanted to believe that she at least might understand why he had done this, that she would see the value in stepping outside one's comfort zone to gain perspective. But when he opened his mouth to explain, all that came out was a heavy sigh. I'm sorry, sweetheart, he murmured finally. I just wanted to teach everyone, including myself, a lesson about empathy. About seeing people for who they really are, not for what they seem. Emily frowned, glancing between her parents and Richard. So, you pretended to be a beggar to prove a point? She asked, her tone skeptical. That's kind of extreme, don't you think? James nodded wearily. Maybe it was, but sometimes extremes are necessary to wake people up. The conversation ended there, with no resolution or closure. Claire stormed back into the house, muttering under her breath about unnecessary drama, while Richard excused himself, clearly eager to escape the awkwardness. Emily lingered for a moment longer, her brow furrowed in thought before following her mother inside. Left alone in the fading light, James sank onto the curb once more, his mind racing. He had set out to test others, to uncover hidden truths about human nature. But in the process, he had discovered uncomfortable truths about himself as well. He realized now that his wealth and privilege had isolated him from the world, creating a gulf between him and those he loved. His family's reactions weren't just reflections of their character. They were mirrors, showing him the consequences of his own choices. Yet amid the pain and frustration, James found solace in one undeniable fact. Change was possible. Tommy's kindness had proven that compassion could thrive, even in the unlikeliest of places. And while confronting his family had been difficult, it was also necessary. If nothing else, James hoped that his experiment would plant a seed, a tiny spark of awareness that might someday blossom into understanding. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, James rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his clothes, one last time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never look at the world, or himself, the same way again. The hours that followed James's confrontation with his family and Richard were some of the quietest and most reflective of his life. The neighborhood had grown eerily silent, save for the occasional chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic from a nearby road. Sitting alone on the curb, James stared at the mansion looming before him. Its grandeur, once a source of pride, now felt hollow and oppressive. The sprawling estate, with its manicured lawns and towering gates, symbolized everything he had worked for, but also everything that had distanced him from the world outside. For years, James had prided himself on being a self-made man, someone who had clawed his way to success against all odds. He had always believed that wealth was a tool, a means to create opportunities, provide for his family, and make a difference in the lives of others. But as he sat there in tattered clothes, surrounded by the trappings of luxury he could no longer relate to, he realized how wrong he had been. His money hadn't just built walls around his home. It had built walls around his heart, shielding him from the struggles and realities faced by so many others. The weight of this realization pressed down on him like a leaden blanket. It wasn't just about Claire's dismissive attitude or Emily's judgmental remarks. It was deeper than that. It was about the values he had inadvertently instilled in them through his actions, or lack thereof. By showering his family with material comforts, he had failed to teach them the importance of gratitude, humility, and empathy. And by isolating himself within the confines of his privileged bubble, he had lost touch with the very humanity he sought to understand. As the night deepened, James made a decision, one that would alter the course of his life forever. He couldn't go back to the way things were, pretending that today's events hadn't happened. Brushing them off as a mere experiment felt dishonest and cowardly. If he truly wanted to grow, if he truly wanted to reconnect with the essence of what it meant to be human, he needed to take drastic action. The next morning, James rose early, his mind made up. He called a meeting with his financial advisor, instructing her to liquidate his assets and sell the mansion. At first she protested, arguing that such a drastic move was unnecessary and impulsive. But James stood firm, explaining that this wasn't about money anymore. It was about purpose. Once the paperwork was underway, he contacted several local charities focused on homelessness, education, and community development. He donated a significant portion of his fortune to these organizations, knowing that his resources could do far more good in their hands than they ever could sitting idle in his bank account. Word of James's transformation spread quickly throughout the community. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what had driven him to such extremes. Some dismissed his actions as a midlife crisis gone awry, while others admired his courage and conviction. Regardless of their opinions, one thing was clear. James Harrington was no longer the same man who had walked through those gilded gates every day. He had shed not only his wealth, but also the armor of privilege that had shielded him for so long. In place of the mansion, James moved into a modest apartment downtown, closer to the heart of the city. It was nothing like the opulent estate he had left behind. Just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room barely big enough for a couch. Yet, for the first time in years, James felt a sense of peace. There was something liberating about living simply, without the constant pressure to maintain appearances or keep up with societal expectations. For the first time, he felt free. But James didn't stop there. Determined to continue learning and growing, he immersed himself in the community. He volunteered at a local soup kitchen, serving meals to people who reminded him of the person he had pretended to be just days earlier. He attended town hall meetings, listening intently to the concerns of residents and offering his support wherever he could. And perhaps most importantly, he reconnected with Tommy, the young boy whose kindness had touched his soul during those long hours on the curb. Tommy became James's unofficial mentee, eagerly soaking up the lessons James had to share about leadership, resilience, and compassion. In return, Tommy taught James the value of seeing the world through innocent eyes, unclouded by cynicism or prejudice. Together, they formed an unlikely friendship that transcended age and circumstance, proving that true connections could flourish in the most unexpected places. One afternoon, as they kicked a soccer ball back and forth in the park, Tommy asked James a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Why did you give away your house?" the boy inquired innocently, wiping sweat from his brow. "Didn't you like it?" James smiled, pausing to consider his answer. "I loved my house," he admitted. "But I realized something important. It wasn't making me happy. Not really. All the fancy cars, the big rooms, the expensive things, they were nice, sure. But they didn't fill the emptiness I felt inside. So I decided to try something different, something simpler." Tommy tilted his head thoughtfully. "Do you feel better now?" "Much better," James replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "Because now I know what truly matters. It's not about having a lot of stuff. It's about having people who care about you. About making a difference, even if it's just in one person's life." Tommy grinned, kicking the ball toward James. "You're weird," he said with a laugh. "But I like you." James laughed too, catching the ball effortlessly. "Thanks, kid. That means a lot." As the weeks turned into months, James continued to embrace his new lifestyle. He found joy in the little things, in shared laughter and helping others, in moments of genuine connection. Though he missed certain aspects of his old life, he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time, he felt grounded, anchored by a sense of purpose that no amount of money could buy. Meanwhile, his family struggled to come to terms with his decision. Claire initially tried to convince him to reconsider, insisting that he was throwing away everything they had worked for. But over time, she began to see glimpses of the man James had become. The kindness in his eyes, the passion in his voice, the authenticity in his actions. Slowly, reluctantly, she started to soften, realizing that maybe, just maybe, there was wisdom in his choices. Emily, too, underwent a transformation. At first, she resented her father for disrupting their comfortable lives, accusing him of being selfish and reckless. But as she watched him dedicate himself to helping others, she began to understand the depth of his commitment. One day, she joined him at the soup kitchen, hesitant at first, but eventually finding fulfillment in lending a hand. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of a journey toward understanding and healing. Richard, however, remained unchanged. He continued to live his life as though nothing had happened, dismissing James's actions as eccentric and impractical. Their friendship faded over time, replaced by a polite distance neither man seemed eager to bridge. Though James mourned the loss of their camaraderie, he accepted it as part of the price he had to pay for staying true to himself. Despite the challenges, James never regretted his decision. He had discovered something far more valuable than wealth: the power of empathy. By stepping outside his comfort zone and immersing himself in the lives of others, he had gained insights that no amount of money could have bought. He had learned that true happiness came not from possessing things but from sharing experiences, building relationships, and leaving a positive impact on the world. And so, as he watched Tommy chase after the soccer ball, laughing with pure abandon, James felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. He didn't need a mansion or a fortune to be rich. All he needed was the knowledge that he was making a difference, one kind act, one meaningful conversation, one heartfelt moment at a time. As the months rolled by, James's new life began to take shape in ways he could never have imagined. Each day brought fresh opportunities to connect with people, to listen to their stories, and to learn from their experiences. Living downtown had opened his eyes to a side of the world he had long ignored, a vibrant tapestry of struggles, triumphs, and resilience. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. It had its share of challenges, from overcrowded schools to underfunded community centers. But it also brimmed with hope, creativity, and an unshakable spirit that inspired James every single day. One crisp autumn morning, James stood outside the local soup kitchen, helping volunteers set up for the day's meal service. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted coffee, mingling with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Inside, tables were arranged neatly, each adorned with simple paper placemats and mismatched utensils. A steady stream of visitors began arriving, men and women carrying worn backpacks, families with young children clutching stuffed animals, elderly individuals leaning on canes. They came from all walks of life, united by a shared need for warmth, nourishment, and human connection. James moved among them, offering smiles and kind words as he handed out plates of food. He remembered how it felt to sit alone on the curb, clutching a cardboard sign, unsure if anyone would notice him. Now, he was on the other side of the equation, doing what he could to ensure no one felt invisible or forgotten. It was humbling work, but it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't known existed before. Among the regular visitors was a woman named Maria, whose story touched James deeply. She worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children after her husband passed away unexpectedly. Despite her exhaustion, she always greeted everyone with a warm smile and a cheerful, "Good morning." Her strength and optimism reminded James of Claire in some ways, but unlike Claire, Maria radiated gratitude even in the face of adversity. Over time, James struck up conversations with her, learning about her dreams of sending her kids to college and starting a small catering business. Inspired by her determination, he offered to mentor her, sharing advice on budgeting, marketing, and networking. Slowly but surely, Maria began to turn her vision into reality, opening a weekend food stall at the local farmers market. Watching her succeed gave James immense satisfaction. It was proof that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating waves of change. Meanwhile, Tommy continued to be a constant presence in James's life. Their bond had grown stronger over time, evolving into something akin to a father-son relationship. Every Saturday, they spent hours exploring the city together, visiting museums, playing soccer in the park, or simply sitting on a bench talking about life. One day, as they strolled along the riverbank, Tommy turned to James and asked, "Do you ever miss your old house?" James paused, considering the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. "It was beautiful, and I loved living there. But I don't miss the way it made me feel, like I was trapped in a bubble far away from everything real." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "You're happier now, aren't you?" "Much happier," James replied with a smile. "Because now I know what really matters. It's not about having fancy things. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself." Tommy grinned, tossing a pebble into the water. "You're still weird, though." James laughed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "And you're still awesome." Back at home, James's family struggled to adjust to his transformation, but not without progress. Claire had initially resisted his decision, clinging to the comforts of their former lifestyle. But as she watched James dedicate himself to helping others, she began to see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with years ago, the idealistic dreamer who believed in making the world a better place. Though she didn't fully understand his choices, she respected his commitment and eventually joined him for a few volunteer shifts at the soup kitchen. To her surprise, she found joy in the experience, discovering a sense of fulfillment she hadn't realized was missing from her life. Emily's journey was slower but equally meaningful. At first, she resented her father for disrupting their comfortable existence, accusing him of being selfish and reckless. But as she witnessed the impact of his actions, seeing the smiles on strangers' faces, hearing their heartfelt thanks, she began to soften. One evening, as they sat together in the modest apartment, Emily confessed, "I used to think you were crazy, Dad. But now, I think you might be onto something." James looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "It's okay to question things, sweetheart. Just don't stop asking questions, and don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone." By winter, James's influence had spread beyond his immediate circle. His story gained attention in the local news, inspiring others to rethink their own priorities. People started volunteering more, donating generously, and engaging with their communities in ways they hadn't before. Even Richard, who had once dismissed James's actions as eccentric, reached out to apologize. Though their friendship remained strained, Richard admitted that James's experiment had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own privilege and complacency. The way holidays arrived, bringing with them a renewed sense of gratitude and togetherness. For the first time in years, James celebrated Christmas in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. Instead of hosting lavish parties at his mansion, he organized a community feast at the soup kitchen, inviting everyone to join in the festivities. Tables groaned under the weight of donated dishes. Laughter echoed through the room and carols played softly in the background. As James looked around at the diverse crowd gathered together, he felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, a reminder that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in connections. On New Year's Eve, James stood on the rooftop of a nearby building, gazing out at the glittering skyline. Beside him stood Tommy, bundled up in a thick coat, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Together they watched fireworks burst across the horizon, painting the night sky in dazzling colors. "What's your wish for next year?" Tommy asked, his breath forming clouds in the frosty air. James smiled, his eyes reflecting the kaleidoscope of lights above. "My wish is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep making a difference, even if it's just in one person's life." Tommy grinned, nudging him playfully. "You're gonna do great, Jimbo." As the clock struck midnight, marking the start of a new chapter, James felt a profound sense of peace. He had traded wealth for wisdom, isolation for connection, and emptiness for purpose. Though the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, living a life rooted in compassion, humility, and love. And so, as the echoes of celebration faded into the night, James Harrington stepped forward into the unknown, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. His journey had been unpredictable, challenging, and transformative. But most importantly, it had been worth it. For in giving up his fortune, he had discovered something far greater: the richness of the human spirit.